Today, let's continue with the sixth episode of our discussion on electronic warfare and information warfare. Without realizing it, we've already reached the sixth episode. I honestly didn't expect this at the beginning. Actually, my show doesn't really have a script, I just go with the flow. But everything I talk about is guaranteed to be true. These are things that you might have only caught glimpses of online before. When you try to piece them together, it's inevitable that you have to check them again to make sure they're accurate. After all, when you speak online, you need to be responsible. So, what is truth? You can't really verify it. We don't have a time machine to travel back to the scene and film it as evidence, do we? What is so-called truth? First, it needs to have a source. It can't just be a product of your imagination, that would be fantasy. Second, is the source reliable? That's hard to say because, especially when it comes to military issues or recent political events, the larger the media outlet, the more politically biased it tends to be. So, I've come to a conclusion about what kind of sources are the most reliable in political news. It's the media closest to the incident, particularly local media. Reports from these sources are more likely to be accurate, especially if they are not reprinted or refuted by opposing forces in the area. Wouldn't you agree? It's just a matter of logic. Let me give you an example. Imagine you're in an elevator with 4 people, all of whom you know. Suddenly, you smell a foul odor. This means that one of these 4 people has passed gas. Then Zhang San shouts, "Hey, Li Si, did you just fart?" Li Si immediately denies it, saying, "It wasn't me." Whoever farted, let their whole family die. Then Li Si turns to Wang Wu and accuses him. If Wang Wu doesn't deny it and just laughs, that's almost like an admission, right? It's the same logic here. So, what is truth? It doesn't necessarily require hard evidence. As long as there's reasonable speculation and one side reports it while the other side doesn't deny it and even tries to cover it up, then it's probably true. At this point, someone might ask, "What's wrong with you today? Why are you rambling on with all this nonsense?" But this isn't nonsense. Time is valuable, and every word I say has a purpose. If you listen closely to the theory I just explained, you'll understand why I'm about to discuss a piece of news from a few months ago that some people might have already forgotten. Let's see if it's true or not. In late October 2023, around the 25th or so, Iranian media announced to the world that they had successfully shot down an F-35 stealth fighter jet over Syria. Do you remember this? At the time, the news spread rapidly on the internet. The US didn't deny it, and Israel didn't deny it either. However, the mainstream media around the world didn't report it. I'm talking about big outlets like CNN and BBC. They didn't pick it up. It was only reported in some Middle Eastern countries, but as time went by, the news faded away. So, did the F-35 actually get shot down or not? Think back to the farting story I just told. The ones involved didn't deny it, and local reports confirmed it, but global media, controlled by capitalist interests, didn't even mention it. The story gradually cooled down and then disappeared. Now, some might ask, how could Syria have shot down an F-35? That's impossible. F-35s are stealth fighters. I might believe it if China shot one down, or maybe even Russia. But Syria, that's ridiculous. You see, this is where cognitive bias comes in. Many people think of Syria as an extremely poor and weak country with no capabilities at all, only able to take hits from an F-35 without fighting back, right? But if you're a top military enthusiast, you should know that in sensitive areas around the world, every organization has some cards up its sleeve. This is something I mentioned in a previous episode. True military enthusiasts eventually have to study current affairs and economics as well. For instance, Syria wasn't always poor. Why is it in such a bad state now, to the point where it seems like anyone can kick it around with no respect? The reason lies in the events around 2010, the so-called Arab Spring and Jasmine Revolution. Just listen to those names, they sound so pure and holy. But as we know, anything that sounds that pure often has something rotten underneath. At that time, I remember people in their country were chanting slogans like "national wealth doesn't matter. What matters is the happiness of the people." It was something like that, similar to the rhetoric you hear online now about not needing national rise, just people's happiness. You see, it's the same tone, but in the end, the country fell apart, and look at the situation now. The people have become refugees in Europe and pawns in the Arab world. used as tools by their supposed brothers. Now, back to the news I mentioned earlier. Why was it Iran reporting that an F-35 was shot down in Syria? Doesn't that show they're being used as pawns? Anyway, let's not get sidetracked. Syria used to be wealthy. They bought more than one set of our GY-27 long-range early warning radars. I think they bought about 5 sets in 2006. Not only that, but they also bought a GYL-1 radar and for 120 type airborne detection radars. They might have even bought a GY-11B radar. These are Syria's radar assets, all purchased before the Jasmine Revolution, back when they had money. Now, let's talk about the GY-27 radar. This piece of equipment is considered a marvel in the world. Why? Because it's a meter-wave radar. This gets a bit technical. What is a meter-wave radar? Basically, it's a type of radar technology that's considered outdated. Meter wave means the wavelength exceeds 1 meter, usually ranging from 1 to 10 meters. If you're good at physics, you'll know that the longer the wavelength, the farther it can travel, but the less clear the signal. In simple terms, it can give you a general idea but not a clear image. Long waves are typically used for communication. So, using this technology in a radar to detect opponents sounds almost impossible. But it has one advantage: stealth aircraft can't absorb the waves from meter-wave radars because they're too long. However, using meter-wave radar to detect stealth aircraft was dismissed by Americans in the early 2000s as impractical. They said the challenge was too great because the long wavelength wouldn't provide an accurate signal, let alone guide a missile to take down a stealth aircraft. But our people, well, we just don't believe in limitations. Why is that? Think about that time period. We had a deep fear of stealth aircraft. Plus, we had been bombed by stealth aircraft. When the US bombed Yugoslavia back then, our Chinese embassy was hit by an American B-2 bomber using laser-guided bombs. We lost 3 comrades. That event was a huge shock for us. At first, it wasn't even reported that it was a B-2 bomber. Initially, we thought it was an F-16. Later, we found out that it was a B-2 bomber. Can you believe that? The B-2 bomber bombed the Chinese embassy, and the US claimed it was an accidental bombing. That's just unbelievable. Think about it: the B-2 bomber flew such a long distance, requiring to mid-air refuelings, just to bomb the Chinese embassy, and then it turned around and flew back. At that time, we were deeply shocked. There was even a rumor that American stealth bombers could reach Chinese airspace at any time and bomb any location, leaving everyone feeling unsafe. The psychological impact on the 1.2 billion people at that time was enormous. So, at that time, we became obsessed with finding ways to counter stealth aircraft, trying everything we could. That's why we started considering meter-wave radar. Logically speaking, using meter-wave radar to counter stealth aircraft seemed impossible. But our country's thinking has always been very creative, not just in military technology but in other areas too. We often find ways to surprise our opponents. For example, with new energy vehicles, our internal combustion engines weren't up to par, and we couldn't compete with the Japanese. Even if we could, it would take time. So instead of trying to catch up, we skipped ahead and focused on electric vehicles, achieving a breakthrough. So, back then, in our efforts to counter stealth aircraft, we took a similar path. Eventually, we found a way through meter-wave radar, carving out a path and making it work. When we first succeeded in developing this radar, no one believed it. I remember reading a report in Reference News around 2004, saying that China had developed a meter-wave radar that could detect stealth aircraft, so there was no need to be afraid anymore. But no one believed it. Later, however, it turned out that this radar was extremely powerful. It wasn't just using meter waves to detect targets, it was a breakthrough in technology. Logically speaking, using meter-wave radar to counter stealth aircraft should be impossible. But our thinking has always been very innovative, not just in military technology, but in other fields as well. We often manage to surprise our opponents in unexpected ways. Take, for example, new energy vehicles. Our car engines weren't great, we couldn't compete with the Japanese. Even if we could, it would take time, so instead of trying to catch up, we skipped ahead and focused on electric vehicles, overtaking them in one move. So when it came to countering stealth aircraft, we took a similar approach. Eventually, we made a breakthrough in meter-wave radar, successfully developing it. When this radar was first developed, no one believed it. I remember reading about it in reference news around 2004, where it was reported that China had developed a meter-wave radar that could detect stealth aircraft, meaning we no longer needed to be afraid. But no one believed it. Later, however, it turned out that this radar was extremely powerful. It wasn't just a simple application of meter waves to detect targets, it represented a technological leap. Its principle is roughly a hybrid of phased array radar technology and meter wave radar technology. You can look up the GY-27 online if you didn't know it was a phased array radar. You might think it's a mechanically scanned radar, but it's actually a phased array radar. Unlike mechanically scanned radars, which need to rotate, the GY-27 is stationary and can even be folded. And here's the clever part: it has wheels underneath, making it highly mobile. It can be moved around easily with a trailer, making it hard to target and destroy. Its operational principle is complex, but to put it simply, each transmitting unit on the radar HTR module is essentially a small meter wave radar. A cluster of these meter wave radars focuses in one direction, with signals overlapping to detect stealth aircraft. The radar has a detection range of 500 kilometers. However, this doesn't mean it can detect everything within that range. It can detect targets with a radar cross-section of 1.5 square meters at that distance. That's quite powerful. Based on this data, it can detect an F-35 at around 300 kilometers and an F-22 at about 200 kilometers. The relationship isn't linear since radar signals spread out in a three-dimensional space, following a cubic relationship. But these figures should be roughly accurate. It should be able to detect an F-22 at over 200 kilometers and an F-35 at over 300 kilometers. That's quite impressive. Even Americans didn't believe it at first, and neither did I. Many people within our own ranks were skeptical as well, so there weren't many reports about it. Also, this radar was probably classified, so not many people knew about it. For these reasons, our leadership decided to sell this advanced radar. This isn't typically our style in the global arms trade. Countries usually sell outdated or mass-produced equipment after downgrading it. That's the rule in the arms business, but this time, we not only didn't downgrade the radar, we actually enhanced it before selling it. It was sold to several countries, including Syria and Iran. Syria, after purchasing it, was also somewhat skeptical, but before they could test it properly, the Jasmine Revolution broke out, leading to civil war, so the radar was left unused. Then, in 2013, we detected an F-22 taking off from a U.S. base in South Korea using the GY-27 radar station in Qingdao, and we locked onto it precisely. In other words, we could have fired a missile and taken it down at any time. Since the F-22 was locked onto by a meter wave radar, it had no idea it was being tracked. Their early warning systems had never been locked onto by meter wave radar before, so something very interesting happened. We were able to precisely track the F-22's flight path, like watching a live broadcast, knowing exactly where it went, what it did, and how it returned to its base. The entire process was completely transparent to us. This was highly classified at the time. Eventually, we became almost obsessed with this radar, constantly monitoring U.S. bases. The F-22 became so frequently observed by us that it practically lost its value. So, how did the Americans find out about this? It was in early 2016 when tensions on the Korean Peninsula were high. The U.S. deployed 4 F-22s to South Korea, thinking they were invisible. So, they carried out several bold actions, assuming we couldn't see them. But we were watching them closely the whole time. If they had just stayed quiet, we wouldn't have bothered with them. But on the morning of February 10, 2016, at 10 a.m., these 4 F-22s entered the East China Sea Fleet's air defense identification zone. They thought they were invisible and could come and go as they pleased. But when we saw them crossing the line, we scrambled dozens of aircraft. The specific models weren't reported, but they were at least J-16s. We surrounded the 4 F-22s. The F-22 pilots were shocked. Aren't we stealth? How can they see us? This isn't supposed to happen. They even got locked onto. The 4 F-22s immediately turned tail and fled. You have to understand that the Yellow Sea is not that big, so the US decided not to launch from their South Korean base anymore. Why? Because they realized they were being watched, so there was no point. This incident left a psychological scar on the Americans. It directly influenced the Pentagon's hesitation in confronting China during the South China Sea standoff in 2016. You could say this radar played a significant role in preventing direct conflict between us and the US in 2016. To be honest, if there had been a conflict back then, our military might not have been as advanced as it is now. This incident probably pushed us to realize that some things should be shown off and not kept hidden. After that, whenever we had new technology, we weren't shy about displaying it. If you always hide your strength, people will underestimate you. When you keep a knife hidden, you're an assassin. When you wear it openly, you're a warrior. Considering our current national strength, we're focused on economic development, so there's no need to be assassins anymore. Now, we should wear our knife openly, letting the world know we're armed and ready. Otherwise, we might have to deal with unnecessary trouble. In 2016, we showcased this radar at the Paris Air Show, showing the world that it could detect stealth aircraft. The slogan was, "I've been watching the US for years, and they never knew." This radar, which we mentioned in our last episode, was developed by CETC. The project even won the second prize for scientific and technological progress. From then on, we made a big show of it. Many countries were interested in buying the radar, but we didn't sell it to just anyone. After all, besides the US, we're the only country with a significant number of stealth aircraft. This radar can detect not only the F-22 but also our own J-20. So, we couldn't just sell it to anyone. We sold it far away, to places like Venezuela in South America. I'm not sure if we sold it to Cuba, but we definitely sold it to Venezuela. I remember on May 14, 2020, an F-22 entered Venezuelan airspace. The US Air Force doesn't usually care about flying near other countries, especially with stealth fighters. But this time, our GY-27 radar detected it and locked onto it, even integrating with the Russian-made S-300 air defense system. Once a plane is locked onto, it's not far from being shot down, so the F-22 quickly turned around and fled. The next day, on May 15, 2020, at 9:15 a.m., an F-22 crashed at the Florida Air Force Base. How it crashed is unknown and wasn't reported, but considering Florida is only about 2,000 kilometers from Venezuela, it's not that far. Florida is in the southeastern US, and Venezuela is just south of the US, so where else could the F-22 have been going? Of course, we don't have conclusive evidence about this, it's just speculation. But going back to 2016, because we demonstrated the radar's capabilities to the Americans, they couldn't sit still. That year, they allocated over $2 billion to research ways to counter meter-wave radars. That money wasn't wasted. They concluded that this radar couldn't be effectively jammed because it operates in the meter-wave range, and the longer the wavelength, the harder it is to jam. The best solution, they decided, was to destroy it. You see, the Americans have money. They spent over $2 billion on this, and who knows how much commission was made. The conclusion they reached wasn't entirely without value. At least Israel took it very seriously. Israel knew that Syria had several sets of this radar. So, in January 2019, Israel launched a surprise attack on a radar base in Syria, reportedly to destroy a GY-21 long-range early warning radar that Syria had imported from China. This radar had become a major concern for Israel. The report at the time said that the Israeli Air Force felt as if it had a thorn in its side, so they took action to destroy the radar. You can see how much Israel feared this radar. Although the radar was bombed by Israel, it didn't really matter. Why? Because the design of this radar is brilliant. You can look it up online. The antenna and electronic components of this radar are positioned far apart, with the electronic system connected to the antenna by cables. The radar's antenna is also mobile, as it has wheels underneath it. This is what is called modular design. So, what Israel actually destroyed wasn't the radar itself, but just the antenna. The main radar unit was far away. If the antenna is damaged, you just replace it, so the radar was quickly repaired. It's really quite amazing how this long-range early warning radar can separate its main unit from its antenna, and even move around. It seems quite unreasonable, in a good way. Israel thought it had eliminated this major threat and then confidently flew its F-35s over Syria. But on July 1, 2019, Iran announced that an Israeli F-35 had been shot down over Syria, and they even released photos of the wreckage. Yet, As with the earlier incidents, the world remained silent. No media outlet reported it, and no one denied it either. It was as if no one had seen it. That news just disappeared. If you don't believe it, you can search for the photos online. Some people ask, why didn't China report this? Why didn't Russia report it? After all, the media in these two countries isn't controlled by Western capital, right? First, let's talk about why China didn't report it. You have to consider who sold the radar to Syria. It was us. Now that the radar has caused trouble by shooting down Israel's F-35, it wouldn't be in our character to boast about it. We Chinese are like this. When we gain an advantage, we keep quiet. But if we suffer a loss, we'll broadcast it to the world. Think about the people around you. Aren't they just like this? That's our national character. And why didn't Russia report it? Think about it. Who is Iran's big brother? It's Russia. When Cyprus released the photos, the whole world knew that Iran and Russia are closely aligned. If Russia had reported it again, it would have been redundant. Since Iran reported it, it's as if Russia did too. There's no need to repeat it. Besides, when the little brother does something, the big brother has to stay calm and steady. Then in 2020, there was another response from Venezuela. They claimed that this radar successfully tracked the takeoff and landing of a B-2 bomber. That means that even the world's most advanced stealth bomber, the B-2, couldn't escape the radar's detection. This boosted Venezuela's confidence to the point where they openly challenged the US, saying they would never surrender and were ready to fight if the US wanted a war. Venezuela rarely speaks so boldly. Where do you think they got that confidence from? It came from this radar. So, after reading this, you might understand what happened to that F-35 shot down in Syria last October. Some people say, even if Syria did shoot down an F-35, what does it prove? If the F-35 was indeed shot down by our radar, then it would be a huge deal. Think about it. What military assets does the US still have? They rely on the F-22 for their stealth fighters, but the production line is gone. Lose one, and there's one less. Other than the F-22, they only have the F-35 left. If the F-35 can be easily shot down by our radar, it would be devastating for the US. Once a plane starts getting shot down, its value drops rapidly. Just like when Yugoslavia shot down an F-117 stealth fighter, which led to the plane losing buyers on the international market and being quickly retired from service. If the F-35 suffers the same fate, it would be like a god bleeding, and the US would fall from its pedestal. The US would lose air superiority, and future US military operations would have to adapt to fighting ground wars without air support. Do you think the US could still wage war under those conditions? Alright, that's all for today. In the next episode, I'll introduce our most powerful electronic warfare equipment. It's the world's first device specifically designed to disrupt data links, targeting the USS Link 16 and Link 22 data links. These data links are like the underlying platforms of the US command system, similar to the Windows XP series we used before. The Link 16 and Link 22 data links are like the DOS system, and the Windows XP system is equivalent to the US command system. C4. If you're a military enthusiast, you'll know what I mean when I mention the C4ISR system, which is the US command system in Asia. So, the final episode might get a bit technical, and only a few people might understand it, but fortunately, we have real combat cases, which should make it interesting.